Hey, CNFers, wouldn't you know, I had the chance to speak with Patrick Radden Keefe, a staff writer for The New Yorker, the best-selling author of Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland, and the host behind the incredible Wind of Change podcast.
And they had to be like, no, that silence is gold. You know what I mean? The don't step on that silence. Like, let it play out. The awkwardness is good.
Oh yes, that's right. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey, and this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. Thank you, friend, for tuning in. We're going to have some fun today, all right? This one with Patrick was in the works for a long time, and he was gracious with his time and his insights. I know you're going to dig it. He's at P. Radden Keefe on Twitter, and you can find him at patrickraddenkeefe.com as well for an archive of his work and other things, other goodies. Listen to this and go check him out if you're like the only person under the sun who isn't familiar with this titan of narrative journalism. A little bit of housekeeping, of course. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, you know, Instagram, Facebook. Tag the show at CNFpod, digital fist bumps. Let me know what you think of this episode, what you took away from it. You can also head over to BrendanO'Mara.com for show notes, where you can leave the show a voicemail. Also, isn't that cool? And I'll answer your query on air as best I can. You can sign up for the monthly newsletter there as well. A curation of book recommendations, cool articles, and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, can't beat it. Patrick is here, and we talk about him cracking the code of Say Nothing with his office mate neighbor. This guy just, David Gran, no bigs. Structure, Patrick's relationship with his editor Daniel Zaleski, Patrick's atypical road to narrative journalism, and how Wind of Change came about as a podcast versus, say, a long magazine article or even a book. You'll also hear his bookshelf for the apocalypse, of course. I hope you'll stay tuned to the end of the show, where I'll give my parting shot, a little thing I'm titling the cookbook mentality. But until then, just enjoy this conversation with me and perhaps my number one draft pick if there was a fantasy team for narrative reporters, Patrick Radden Keefe. Huh. Your most recent one anyway. What was so great about listening to you guys talk, it was like, watching Baseball Tonight when A-Rod and Frank Thomas are talking hitting or something. It's like, it was like that for me to be sitting in on these two pros talking shop. It was just really cool to hear you guys break it down. It was a really great conversation.
I'm so glad to hear that. That's nice for you. Yeah, it was fun for me, particularly because I've known Evan for years and years, and we did an earlier long form podcast at a very different stage of my life and his life and our careers, and so it was just it was so fun to kind of pick up that conversation. And it is a very nuts and bolts conversation. I mean, that's one of those ones that I think you really have to be interested in this kind of writing. But if you are, hopefully it's interesting.
Oh, of course. It's certainly anyone who listens to long form, even people who listen to this show. I do love, pulling back the curtain a little bit, getting into some of those nuts and bolts. And I kind of, in that vein, piggybacking on that sport metaphor, watching film and deconstructing what's going on.
Sure.
Who are some of those writers and journalists, reporters for you, where you put them on the game tape and you're deconstructing them, how's this guy how's this guy or this woman doing this, and trying to apply that to your own reporting and your own writing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the things that is, to be perfectly honest with you, still profoundly strange about my life is that a lot of those people, for me, when I was younger, are people who subsequently I came to know, and they became colleagues at the New Yorker. So it's so there are people like Philip Gurevich or Larissa McFarcar or David Gran, who I read when I was younger, and really did try to deconstruct those pieces and think, how did they do this? How did they put these things together? And to this day, it's very strange to me that I now know them and work alongside them. I had this especially surreal experience with my last book, Say Nothing, where for a period of time, this is when the New Yorker was in the old office. The person who was in the office next to me was David Gran, and he would come into the office from time to time. And I mean, it was a little bit surreal, right, to think that I would hit a kind of a thorny narrative problem, just a storytelling problem. Here's my dilemma. How do I dole out this information? How should I go about this? Or a reporting problem. And just the thought that it's like, well, why not go next door and ask David Gran what he would do? Was kind of comical. To this day, I count my good fortune.
Yeah, and when I had spoken to him, a while ago when Killers of the Flower Moon came out, and speaking of narrative problems, what really cracked open that book for him was reading Faulkner's Ab Absalom, and the three-pronged narrative structure, and that informed how he sort of cracked the code of Killers of the Flower Moon. Similarly, maybe when you were picking his brain, like what narrative puzzles did he help you crack? Similarly.
There were, I mean, the really big one was that I made this discovery very late in the game when I was working on Say Nothing. Almost by accident, I stumbled on the identity of the person who was the killer in this notorious 1972 murder that is kind of the basis for the whole book. And
just a jaw-dropping moment.
I mean, it was for me in my reporting as well, and I hope it was in the book because in some ways, all I was trying to do was convey the shock I felt myself, and hope that some of that resonated with the reader. But when I first made the discovery, it was this tricky thing where I had connected these dots, and there were a series of questions I had about thresholds of proof. At what point is it acceptable in a book to name a living person who has never in any way been associated with a murder and say, I believe this is the murderer? When is it okay to do that? What a quantum of evidence do you need? And then B, how do you tell that to the reader? How do you present it to the reader? And David was one of the first people I talked to. The big thing that he said was, you've got to go back to everybody you talked to already, because now you have a theory of the case. It's sort of the Woodward and Bernstein thing, right? It's one thing to go and ask people open-ended questions. It's another thing to go to people and say, I know this. What do you have to say about it? And so I did that. I went back to Ireland and I spoke to a bunch of people. I had to keep the circle somewhat small because I didn't want too many people to know that I'd figured this out. But there were key people who I wanted to go back to and present that to. And that ended up getting me to where I needed to be personally to be comfortable naming this person. And also, I hope to a point where I could persuade the reader. At the end of the day, all I can say to the reader is, I've done all this work, and here's the conclusion that I draw. But let me show you the steps I took, the deductive steps. And so this was part of what came out of this conversation with David, was the idea that if you narrate that investigative process, it may be that there are some readers who are unconvinced, but you're doing it with a kind of transparency and good faith that won't run the risk of trying to stretch the available evidence into a theory, to a place, trying to take it to a place it doesn't want to go.
Were lawyers essentially your copy editors at that point too?
Yeah, and what was crazy about that was it was lawyers lawyers in New York, lawyers in Dublin, and lawyers in London, all of whom
Oof.
had different, because there were these three different jurisdictions that we had to think about. It was a pretty fraught process. But to be honest with you, I feel as though, for better or for worse, with the stuff I write about, lawyers almost always enter the equation.
Right. And the way it was coming to a head in the book too, and the way certain characters were always kind of just resurfacing, whether through a different identity in the case of Brendan Hughes or other people, you just that the identity of that third person. I was just waiting for the shoe to drop. I'm like, who is this? I know we know this person, and then it comes down and it's just like, holy fucking shit, that's who it was. And you just don't really get that much in narrative nonfiction sometimes. And wow, what a hammer!
Yeah, I mean, and I should say, I didn't go looking for it.
Yeah.
The it's funny because in a fair number of the reviews of the book, people characterized it as a whodunit, and I wrote pretty much the whole book not thinking of it as that at all. My assumption was this is a story about a murder and its repercussions. I know the identity of a number of people kind of around that murder, but not the person who pulled the trigger. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's probably somebody who's not one of my characters. And because of the rules that I had created for myself in terms of how I wanted to write the book, my feeling was basically, I want to see this entirely through the eyes of this handful of people. And so if it's some other random dude, then it won't be all that interesting to me or to readers to say, oh, and there's this random gunman, and it turns out he's the guy who pulled the trigger. So it wasn't something I was looking for. The crazy thing is when I stumbled on it, it was really by accident. And then it turned out it was somebody who was one of my characters all along. And so that was like looking back on it, it takes on this Agatha Christie quality. But that was really only true once I made this discovery. It didn't feel that way during the, almost 4 years I spent working on the project before I made that realization.
Yeah, and if I recall right from, I think it was when you were talking with Evan in the last episode of long form that you did with him. It was just like you were on like a very late pass of the notes you made of a certain transcript. So it was almost like you almost accidentally stumbled on this thing you probably felt like you should have caught far earlier in the process. And it's like, this could have gone to print, and then you find out. I mean, it's the fortuitous nature of the timing of that. It couldn't have worked out better for you.
Yeah, but it is, you're absolutely right that it's one of those kind of self-exposing anecdotes that actually shows what a sloppy hack I am, right? Because it was only because I went back almost as an afterthought and just said, hey, is there anything in this 30-page single-spaced transcript that I might have missed? And I think it's on the one hand, in terms of my own process, I am a big believer in the idea that when you read through something the first time, the stuff that sticks with you on that first read is probably the stuff that you want to tell a reader. Like I have colleagues who obsessively go over their own notes from their own interviews, kind of trying to find things that had eluded them. Whereas my philosophy is much more, in a way, I don't want to go back to the notes at all. After I've done a 2-hour interview, I want to think about the things that stick in my mind.
Yeah.
And those are probably the things that I should use in the telling. But in some ways that episode at the end of Say Nothing is an illustration of the limits of that particular approach, to be completely kind of off the cuff first impression. What grabs you right away is sometimes to ignore pretty important stuff that's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah. Did that experience create some sort of like internal anxiety for you now going forward, in that like, oh my God, what else might I be missing if I don't go back and reread this with this thing or with these notes?
Yeah, I mean, there is some of that. And I think it's it can be a paralyzing fear depending on the story because, I mean, in some instances, some of the stuff I'm working on entails, no exaggeration, tens of thousands of pages of court documents, for instance. And I think there's some degree of kind of neurotic compulsion that's really fruitful and productive in that kind of a situation. The thing that makes you keep going back to the pile and turning the pages and seeing what you might be missing. But it also, if you give into that too readily, I think it quickly becomes a kind of madness, right? Where you
Right.
can just sort of endlessly report thinking that you're missing, some particular gold thread that's eluding you.
Hmm. And at what point, if you're working on a long magazine feature, in the case of the three books you've written and the one that you've got coming out next year, at what point are you starting to think about structure and that part of the narrative framework of a story so you can spin a good yarn?
So this has changed pretty dramatically for me since I started writing longer feature pieces, about 15 years ago. And it'd be hard to pinpoint the moment where it changed, but because I tend to take a pretty research intensive approach to this kind of writing. I do a ton of reporting, and I like to report, and it's always been most of my, it's 90% of the work for me. I don't
Hmm.
the writing is not an afterthought by any stretch, but it's the last thing that happens. The danger of that for me is that it just becomes an open-ended process, and you're just gathering more and more stuff, and every day you gather more and more stuff, and you end up with this endlessly proliferating compost heap of material. And there's lots of interesting stuff in there, but I think at a certain point it's, at least for me, it's diminishing returns. And so there's an inflection point where you have to start thinking about structure, and for me that point has come earlier and earlier, I think. Certainly in recent years, which isn't to say that I'm cooking the books. It's not to say that if there's one thing that I hate, and it happens with every piece, it's when you get on the phone with somebody and they start out by saying, "So what's your angle?"
Oh
And,
yeah.
and I'm always like, "I don't have an angle. Let's talk and tell me what happened, and I'll develop my angle later." So I do tend to think you want to follow the facts and sort of figure out the story they tell. It's not that I want to prefigure the narrative, but I do think that for me it's really helpful at a certain point to say, who are the characters? Who am I focusing on here? What are the big beats in the story? And what can I leave out? And that point where I can start leaving out becomes, it's very liberating, because then in a weird way, then the reporting continues, but it's narrowing rather than widening, if that makes sense. It's you're beginning to focus in more and more on the stuff that you really need to know, because it's going to go in,
Yeah.
as opposed to just sort of, oh, this guy's interesting, let's read his three books and figure out his biography, and maybe he'll fit in the piece somewhere, which I think is a dangerous, at least for me, is a dangerous temptation.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. You can really, it's a productive way to procrastinate if you're not careful.
It is, and you curse yourself, because I think that and again, I think I've gotten a lot better about this over the years, but I think there is this tendency that a lot of reporters have, when you make a discovery that seems inherently interesting, and particularly if it was hard for you, if you worked hard to make that discovery, to then feel as though you have to shoehorn it into the story you're telling. And I think a lot of bad writing, or not bad writing, but a lot of writing that may lack the kind of focus and drive that it should have. One of the pitfalls is that people are shoehorning in stuff that actually doesn't. It's interesting, but it doesn't belong in the story.
And and to that end, like, you can of course like put that stuff in, then maybe rewrites, it starts coming out, and those are sometimes the dialogues you're having with with an editor and a wingman. And Daniel Zalewski, is it Zaleski or
It's
Zalewski?
Zaleski. Yeah.
So you've been working with him for a long time, and he's just kind of a narrative whisperer, if you will. Like, so many of the things that he's worked on and helps usher through are some of the most brilliant pieces that come out in the New Yorker. He's a brilliant reporter and a writer. So what's your relationship with him, and how has he coached out the best in you over the years?
It would really be impossible to do him justice. He is, I think he's pretty much a one of a kind brain, in terms of a certain kind of heavily reported narrative nonfiction. And I first connected with him, it was 15 years ago. I freelanced for years before I went on staff at the New Yorker, but I worked with him starting with my first piece. And he's, the relationship has evolved over the years, but he has an incredible sense of what is a story. And he has this amazing kind of roving intellect where we have these ideas meetings at the New Yorker where you come in and you sort of pitch 3 ideas, not necessarily for you, but just that the magazine should be thinking about. And most of my ideas are kind of in my wheelhouse, like whether they're for me to be writing about or not. And the amazing thing is you watch Daniel and he'll have a pitch about some crazy cutting edge discovery and nanotechnology, and then his next pitch is about some obscure but brilliant composer who's just like on the cusp, and his next pitch will be about some sort of behind the scenes intrigue in Washington. But what the through line, the DNA, is that he has this just kind of preternatural sense of story. And so I think you see that if you think about the writers that he edits. David Grand, Jane Mayer, Lawrence Wright, and on and on and on. A bunch of the greats, and you see that kind of manifest in all of their work. And for me, it's a steady back and forth in which we're talking about ideas on the front end and what would make a good piece and how I could do it. And then I go off and start reporting, and often I'll check in with him along the way, sometimes just with excitement to kind of get somebody else in the foxhole with me and say, hey, look what I discovered. But often with a sense of, I'm trying to figure out where this goes, or I've got this source who won't talk, or, I've just discovered this new thing and this may change the whole complexion of the piece. And then he's very, very involved once I submit a draft, and all the way through to the closing at a kind of line by line, word by word, incredibly exacting level. But he's amazing, and I feel incredibly lucky every day to work with him.
Yeah, that's it's so great. Everyone anytime I hear his name brought up, it's brought up in the same
reverence.
With reverence, it is, because he kind of what the great editors do is they just make the writer shine and get out of the way, and it's such a unique thing. And it seems like and I've never spoken to him and I don't know him, but it seems very devoid of ego, and he's very happy to celebrate in the success of the writer, and that's got to be its own gratification.
Yeah. It's crazy because you mentioned, he's a writer and reporter himself and has written these amazing profiles. And I'm still hoping one day I think there should be a book. They should put all of his profiles together in a book, because if you look at them end to end, they're amazing. But yes, the thing that is so, I do think that there's a kind of selflessness to editors, be they, book editors, magazine editors, newspaper editors, in which the metabolism of a big reported feature for me is, I'll spend 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 months working on something, and the final stretch is a couple of weeks in which Daniel is involved in a very intensive day-to-day way, and then we close the piece, and I basically get to sleep all weekend and then do a victory lap on Monday. And he starts, and he comes in on Monday and dives into that intensive process with somebody else's. This happened 2 weeks ago. I had a piece. It was a web piece, but a 5,000 word web piece, heavily reported. Lawyers involved. It was an intensive operation, and he closed it. I think literally he closed it between closing a big piece by Jane Mayer and a big piece by Paige Williams, and they all came out they all posted within 48 hours of one another.
And you have a pretty atypical path to narrative journalism. It doesn't involve J School or that track. Of course, you went to Columbia and you got your JD at Yale, and it's not what you would consider a typical path. So what was it about, or narrative journalism? Maybe what were you reading that kind of turned a light bulb on and said, I kind of want to try this out?
I think the thing is, I had always wanted to be a writer. I didn't know precisely what that would look like.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this, I think I was risk averse enough that I felt like I needed some kind of a cover story or a day job, particularly in college and immediately post college. I knew certain people who would like sit in cafes and meet people and tell them that they were a writer, or, and say I'm a writer, and I found the kind of the pose of that a little off-putting.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was much more, I'm going to keep this is going to be this secret thing that I nurture until it's real. And what that meant in practice is I went to grad school, I went to law school, I did all this other stuff, but I always knew that what I wanted to do was right. It just was taking me a while to figure out how to make it happen. And so even by the time I got to law school, I mean, I think I got the deal to write my first book at the end of my first year of law school. So at that point, it suddenly began to feel real.
That's awesome. That just, you like being like under the water doing this. It just reminded me of what, when you say in Wind of Change, the surfacing moment when the
Yeah,
submarine
yeah,
comes up. That just hit me. It was just like, here's Patrick. He's surfacing with the writing career.
yeah. It was a little bit like that. It was a little bit like that, but I just think that there was I mean, it makes me blush to think about it, but it's like I have friends who, back when I was in grad school, there's a friend who always gives me a hard time about this. But about me, we were on a plane and like on a overnight flight to England, and everybody else is just like hanging out, and I whipped out my laptop and I'm typing away, and I was working on like an article that I hoped would run somewhere. Of course, it never did, right? There was a lot of trial and error and a lot of rejection in those early stages.
What gave you confidence during those that era of rejection that allowed you to keep going in the face of it?
I think it was partially a sense that this was this thing that I just really wanted to do. I would be lying if I said I thought I was all that good at it. It wasn't a sense where I was convinced I was a genius and the world just didn't understand. It was more, to me, the notion of like writing big articles for the New Yorker magazine was just I couldn't conceive of a better job than that. And so I think it was a stubbornness, and then also a rapidly dawning appreciation of what a terrible lawyer I would make. So in some ways, like law school was a very useful exercise for me in a whole bunch of ways. And it's like an expensive and time consuming way to learn that you don't want to be a lawyer, but that message was brought home.
And over the course of your reporting and your writing, do you run into the nerves that sometimes come in when you're, maybe you've got a big source and a big interview ahead of you, and you've done all your research, or maybe you feel like maybe you haven't done enough, and I don't know. I get a bit of a sort of chest tightness sometimes when I go into interviews, no matter how much research I've done, no matter how many times I've done, this thing between us. Sometimes I get just that niggling anxiety. So I wonder if that's something you experience, and if you do, how do you work through it?
Yeah, I mean, so two thoughts. One is that I think there's some kind of standard social anxiety that I mean, I'm an old guy. I've been doing this a long time, and I really thought that it would go away,
Yeah.
but I still get nervous picking up the phone to call a stranger.
Yeah, me too.
And, not like cripplingly nervous, but I feel it in my chest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's strange is I look back almost 20 years when I was working on my first book, and I was a law student. I had a book contract. But I didn't have any affiliation with any newspaper or magazine. I'd never really written for a newspaper or a magazine, and I was calling people to ask them for an interview, and I felt like it was just so open-ended. It's like, hi, I'm this guy. You don't know anything about me. And to the degree that I can tell you anything, it's that I'm a law student, which shouldn't actually, I'm a student. It's like it's not going to command all that much respect. And at the time, I think I thought my nerves, I thought like, oh, once you have a legitimate thing to tell people, I sort of thought, that it's like when you can say, hey, it's Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, they're like, that's it, it's Cy Hirsch or the New Yorker, that you would command just natural confidence, and that I don't think that's necessarily the case. On the preparation thing, it's a little different in the sense that for the kind of interviews you're doing, it wouldn't be much of a conversation unless you were prepared, right?
Right.
And for me, it's not that I don't prepare, I do, but I generally don't go in with a huge list of questions. I tend to prefer interviews to be pretty open-ended. So I may have some specific things I want to hit, but I don't have a script. I also have this thing that I've gotten better at over the years, which is that I tend to find that the interview is much better if the person thinks I'm an idiot and I don't know anything. Like I used to have this desire to like prove that I was hip and like show them how much preparation I'd done.
Right. Yeah.
I guess to win their respect or something. And I realized that doesn't produce good answers. Like the reader hasn't done all that preparation, right? So it's better for the reader if what I'm presenting them is quotes from an expert who's talking as though they're addressing a 12-year-old.
Right. Because you'll probably find that if you over research in that way and trying to overcome some sort of insecurity, that in a sense you might be answering questions for them instead of getting good tape.
Yes, totally. And the worst is when they feel like, oh, well, clearly you've done your homework. Like I don't need to explain what and then pick the thing is, like whatever this concept is. And those are actually the moments where it would be so much better to say, yeah, I'm not sure I really understand that. Can you explain it to me? And you kind of force them to do the exposition. And it may be that in the end, you're better at the exposition than they are, but it's worth giving them a shot because sometimes people are really brilliant at, if it's a specialist, they've had a lifetime of practice of like explaining to relatives or whoever else what they do in simple language.
Exactly. And so as you're a print guy, books, New Yorker, and then of course Wind of Change, this story that's been, chewing at you for over, for close to 10 years when you launched Wind of Change. How does that come to the table, and how does that become a podcast versus a narrative podcast versus maybe, doing a long feature or even a book?
Yeah, so this was a thing I'd been thinking about for a long time, and a part of what I was thinking about was how do you tell the story? And I have a theory, and so this is, I think this is a Zaleski theory that I would say I borrowed it, but it was more that I was forced to adopt it as one of his writers, that if you have a story that's a mystery and you want to do a 10,000 word magazine article, you'd better solve the mystery at the end. That there's something about telling a complicated story that's going to take somebody the better part of an hour to read, where if they get to the end and you say, and we'll never know, but thanks for reading, they'll feel like they want their hour back. And this has kind of come up a million times because you pitch a piece and you say, oh, here's this interesting thing. And it's like, well, can you nail it? Can you solve the mystery? And if you can't, it's usually a pretty high bar. So that was the problem, was that I always knew with the Scorpions and the CIA that, either the CIA wrote this metal ballad or they didn't. But either way, it's going to be very hard to come up with, to either prove the positive or prove the negative in a kind of definitive dead to rights way. And so what that meant was that for years, this was it was something I was really interested in, but I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And I was certain it wouldn't work as a magazine article. And then the big revelation for me was that it could be a podcast. And so it's funny, you might think with the podcast that the fact that it's all about music is the reason I wanted to do it in an audio form. And it's not the first. I mean, that was kind of a nice benefit, but the initial reason that it took that form was that there's something about podcasting where, you get to the end of the first season of Serial and they say like, maybe Adnan did it, maybe he didn't, thanks for listening. Um, and actually, I think some people might have complained about the ending, but lots and lots and lots of people felt as though this was hugely worthwhile and totally interesting. And I'm still trying to sort out why that is. I think it has something to do with the voice in your ear, the identification you feel with the reporter. But somebody said of my show, of Wind of Change, that podcasting is a very generous medium, and I think that's true.
Hmm. And I listened through it twice, and it was one of those deals where, especially the second time I heard it through, I'm like, part of the appeal of this whole thing again is just it's like report like a story about the search more than the answer, and there are enough footprints leading up to the goal line without scoring the touchdown that almost it kind of answers it for you without really, giving you the medicine, if you will. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know. Did it strike you like that? Because that's kind of how it landed on my ear.
Yeah, I mean part of what was interested in his ambiguity,
Yeah.
and weirdly enough, it all kind of comes full circle. But my first book was about the National Security Agency, and it was sort of about it was a book about my failure to write a book about the National Security Agency,
Hmm.
and it seemed interesting to me that the biggest intelligence agency in the country, which has a huge impact on the United States and global affairs, was totally unknown, and there was just a kind of a sense that it's so secret that it's not really subject to democratic accountability or accountability by the press and what have you. And that to me was interesting. And so here too, I felt as though there are these mysteries and these things that sometimes you never will know. And I was interested in that, in interrogating that. And the metaphor that I really liked is my friend, a very good friend, Jonah Weiner, who's also a magazine writer, writes for the New York Times Magazine. And Jonah listened to the episodes as we were making them and was giving me notes. And he had this great image. He said it's like you're the central mystery. It's like you're going up a spiral staircase, and the central mystery is the banister. And along the way, you keep pointing to these interesting pictures on the wall, but you always have one hand on the banister. And that was kind of the way I thought of it.
Yeah, yeah, and there are those moments too. Like if we bring it back to the whole surfacing thing, like you in the episode that really focuses on Doc McGee, you've done a lot of your research and you go to him and he's thinking it's going to be this one thing. And then you even like comment on the fact that you're about to surface to us. And then you surface to him and it's just like the tenor kind of changes. And it's like, you can't really pull that off in print. And that was so perfect in audio.
Yeah, I mean, it was this was for me a big part of the learning curve, and the fun of doing this. And I should say, I mean, I was brand new to all this. I'd never done anything. I'd been a guest on podcasts like this before, but I didn't know anything about podcasting other than as a listener. But I was in incredibly good hands. I had, these amazing producers, particularly Henry Malofsky, who was kind of my partner on the whole thing, and Joel Lovell was my editor, and they had coached me on how audio is just very different from print. And one of the big things that they said early on when I'd done, I mean, we did almost 100 interviews for this thing, so it was it was a gradual learning
So
curve for
much
me.
tape.
Yeah, it was a ton of tape, but they said at a certain point that I had this tendency to rush in and fill the silence. So if I was talking to somebody and they were uncomfortable, I would my natural tendency, just as as somebody with some emotional intelligence, but also as a reporter who's always trying to put people at ease, is I'll rush in and fill the silence. I'll talk and try, and if I can hear discomfort in your voice, I want to talk you back from the ledge and make you comfortable. That's what I've done my whole career when I'm interviewing people. And they had to be like, no, 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 that silence is gold. You know what I mean? The don't step on that silence. Like, let it play out. The awkwardness is good. And by the time we went to see Doc McGee and then later Klaus Meine, I had learned that lesson. And I think, I think it shows, because I do think the awkwardness and the tension is effective.
Yeah, and in I think it was before that interview, and before the Klaus Meine interview, where you did express some sort of pre game time jitters or nerves, and it's what's funny is in this piece, and you said earlier that you're kind of risk averse, but you've kind of like through the course of your reporting, you kind of put yourself in these situations where our spy thriller mind would be like, yeah, Doc McGee's gonna close the windows. His team of goons is gonna come in after you surface, and he's gonna take you out and bludgeon you. And it's just it was really funny when I was like thinking of that, visualizing it.
Well, that's great. I mean, yeah, there's a moment in the final episode where I talked about at the very end of the show where I talked about how how Henry and I were feeling super spooked, but at the same time, simultaneously, we were feeling really silly for feeling so spooked.
Right.
And that was the thing I wanted to. That was the sensation I was hoping to bottle with the show. And so, to the degree that the listener can vicariously feel any of that, I'm really happy. Like, I'm happy to hear you felt that way, because that was what I wanted to get across.
Right. And through the course of the production of Wind of Change, this is kind of a two-parter. In what way did, say, your experience as a reporter and a writer kind of inform the podcast, and then coming out of the podcast, how was that maybe, I don't know, just rewired you in a certain way that might be bleeding into your writing in a way that you would have never known had you not done Wind of Change?
Oh, it's interesting. I don't know. It certainly the podcast was very much in some ways it was it grew naturally out of the work I've done over the years, even though most of that work is somewhat different. Particularly tonally, it was tonally it was very different for me. But so it was this weird thing where on the one hand it was kind of a departure, right? And for me, I mean, it was this fun thing that I did between, my book about war crimes in Northern Ireland and my book about the opioid crisis in the United States. The idea that I got to spend a year, interviewing crazy ex-spies and like guys from Skid Row and run around going to rock concerts and just having fun. It was great. It was just I loved it from start to finish. As for how it changes things moving forward, I don't know. I mean, I don't have any immediate plans to make another podcast. I'd like to, but I think I don't want to do one just to do one. So it would really have to be the right story. Yeah. And in terms of my writing, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if it influences it. I've done something I've done on the side for years and years, is screenwriting. And I realized in the last few years that my screenwriting has actually really affected the way I write nonfiction. So it'll be kind of interesting to see if something similar happens with podcasting, but nothing discernible so far.
In what way has the screenwriting influenced your narrative writing?
Mostly in terms of edits. Like when you get into a scene and when you get out of it, and then juxtaposing scenes. I mean, it's mostly about kind of bringing in some new piece of information at the end of a scene. And then I think the natural tendency would be to unpack it and explain it. But in the language of screenwriting, right, it's like I'll cut away. I'll cut away to something else.
Yeah.
Knowing that I've just gotten your attention because you want to know about whatever this thing is that I've just dangled. And that then buys me time to, tell you about something else for 5 pages in the hopes that you'll stick around because you want to see what's going to happen with that thing. I mean, it's sort of the oldest trick in the book in terms of, movie edits. And, it's one that I found it kind of snuck into my writing before I consciously realized where it had come from.
And I like to, at the beginning of Wind of Change, how you essentially narrate how a lot of your a through line of your stories is secrets and secret worlds and uncovering things I'm not supposed to know, and a conviction, as you go on to say, that the real story lies in whatever room we're locked out of. So where does that come from, and where's the? Of course, we're all intrigued by secrets, but I think with you, it's you take it another step further because you're pursuing such stories that are just so gripping.
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know, and I think the really strange thing is in that little speech at the beginning of Wind of Change. I mean, it was only retrospectively where I was forced. I'd been asked a handful of times, what's the through line here? Like, how do you connect all these random stories? And that was the best thread that I could come up with. It's not like there's some formative childhood experience of some locked room or whatever, and it's definitely not that I have any kind of a formula for what seems worth pursuing. It's all in the gut. It's all just this sense of, oh yeah, you know, that feels like something I want to explore. But I don't know. I honestly, I have no idea. I think it's, some of it is probably a slightly juvenile sense that the thing you tell me I'm not supposed to know is immediately going to become the thing I want to know.
Right. And I love how I think you tie it up really nicely at the end, of course, because we know it, spoiler alert, we don't really know in the end, though you can surmise that it's something that the CIA could have cooked up. But at the end, it's this nice scene after you talk with Klaus Meine in Hanover, and he's at the bar, and you just, he's just talking with a local there, and you don't approach him again, but you start to think that maybe that seed that you had planted a seed in his head that maybe this had happened, or maybe he knew all along. And then you end this thing of just saying like, what if? And I think I think it's just like the perfect little grace note that maybe Klaus is thinking about it, and of course we're thinking about it. So that was just a great piece of writing, and of course performative reading that you leave that hanging, and it just feels really satisfying, even though the mystery goes unsolved.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say so. Yeah, I mean, it was as you can imagine. So we didn't know how this. We didn't know what Klaus was going to do. Like we
Right.
didn't know. We thought that this could have ended with Klaus Mino like flipping over the table and like shrieking, "Go fuck yourself," and walking out. Right.
Right.
Um, I was pretty certain it wouldn't end with him being like, "You got me!" Like finally, like the truth has caught up with me. But we just didn't know, and so he, for my purposes, like short of a full confession, it was the perfect ending because he was so great and kind of willing to go through the whole thing, but also he was so enigmatic. So in a weird way, like if you wanted to preserve the ambiguity, I mean, it's just hilarious because I've had so many people get in touch with me. I've had tons and tons of people get in touch with me and say like, when I got to the last episode, I listened to Klaus Meine talking, and it was plainly obvious to me that like the CIA had nothing to do with this song, and he's just totally confused, and this whole thing has been a wild goose chase. And then I've had so many people get in touch and be like Klaus is totally in on it, like it's so obvious, and like pointing to particular moments in it's a kind of perfect Rorschach where different people hear different things, and so from a purely narrative point of view, he really he was very obliging.
And as we bring this airliner down for a landing, Patrick, I'd love to ask you this little thing. It's kind of a goofy way of asking what's really influential books for people. I always call it the sort of bookshelf for the apocalypse. A few books that you just keep in your knapsack that are taking the place of some canned goods that could very well nourish you, but these things nourish you in a different way. And I was wondering maybe what some of those books are, and then maybe why they're so important to you.
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned that you would ask me this, and I thought about it, and I kind of surprised myself because they're mostly novels, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't read nearly as much fiction as I used to. I used to read a lot more. I still do read fiction, but not as much as I used to. And so strangely, they're mostly novels from a time when novels just had a huge impact on me. And so the ones that I often go back to and think about. So I mean, probably Virginia Woolf, probably To the Lighthouse, which I
Mm-hmm.
read in college, but was one of those books that just kind of just sort of changed the way I saw the world and saw writing. And then a bunch of another one again from that sort of same era, but a book that I revisit. Well, I mean, it's a bunch of Nabokov. I read a ton of Nabokov in college, and I don't know if it'd be Pale Fire or Panine, would probably be my favorites. And then weirdly a genre book that I read my first year of law school that again just kind of changed the way I thought about writing was Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow. Kind of a, like a legal thriller, but I think of a very high literary order. I thought it was fantastic. And I go back to that one a lot. Another one that sort of fits in that wheelhouse would be The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I also go back to a lot. And then the last, I think, to round it out, one of my favorite novels ever, and I got to know the person who wrote it later, which was wild. But Helen DeWitt's book, The Last Samurai, which I read. I was living in England in grad school, and I read that book, and it was just, I think as with those others, it's those moments. The books that really register with me are the ones that are both kind of completely absorbing on a page by page basis, but also just sort of just kind of change your sense of what a book can do.
And isn't that kind of why sometimes we kind of get into this racket too? Because you read those books and they do something to you, rewire your brain and make you just think of things differently and entertain you in such a way. And then, if you dare to have sort of that audacity of spirit, if you will, to step into that arena, that maybe if you're humming at full capacity, maybe you can have a similar effect on somebody else.
I mean, I think so. I think the thing that was really strange for me when I thought about it is that I truly, if it's like the desert island thing, like I wouldn't bring Robert Caro or, the sort of, there's any number of great nonfiction books that mean a lot to me, but yeah, I think it's, and it's strange kind of looking back to these formative reading experiences that happened 20 years ago or more. But it is strange to me that the like visceral sensation that you have as a reader, like I can sort of describe the almost physical reaction to reading The Last Samurai in like the year 2000. That to this day is a more kind of vivid reading experience than, some terrific book that I read 2 weeks ago.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Patrick, I need to be mindful of your time, of course. I've been just a titanic fan of your work for a while, and this is such this is just such an honor and a thrill to get to speak to you about it and about your approach and everything. For people who might not be familiar with your work or where to find your work, where can they find you online and and get more familiar with your work if they aren't already?
So probably I have a website which is just patrickraddenkeefe.com, and I'm on Twitter at P. Radden Keefe.
What a voice, right? He's got a great voice. Unbelievable writer and reporter. Thanks so much to Patrick for the time, and for you, of course, for listening and being part of this CNF community. Don't forget that if you need an editor or a coach to hold you accountable, I can be that guy for you, and I would be honored to be that guy, to see things you can't see. Sessions with me include Skype calls, transcripts of those calls, that's cool, detailed critique of the work, email support, and the peace of mind knowing that you've got me in your corner. Email me to start a dialogue, brendan@brendano'mara.com. Lately, I've been swollen with dread. I don't know what it is. I've been waking up in the morning and nothing seems possible. I come up with what I think are good ideas and I start to think, well, if it was any good, somebody else would have done it already. Then I get into this frame of mind that success is for other people and that people like me, it's not an option. Been dealing with that. You ever deal with that? It's a crummy place to be, let me tell you. I don't know what to do. Maybe try to journal the shit out of it. Maybe it'll die on the vine. I don't know. But I got to thinking this week, too, about cookbook authors. And this is that thing I was talking about earlier at the top of the show about cookbook mentality. And what are cookbook authors and chefs doing? What are all the famous chefs doing? They're giving away recipes. They are telling you how to cook like them. Even putting down the stuff they make in their restaurants. On their menus, sometimes it is right in those cookbooks. They're not worried about secrets. They're giving the secrets away and saying, here, I made this for you to try. And with a little rigor and some technique and some good little kitchen gadgets, whatever, you can have it at home too. It's something I've taken to calling, like I said earlier, a cookbook mentality, which is to say, be generous, don't hold back, don't hoard secrets or techniques. If something works really well for you, share it. Why not? Other people can substitute different ingredients for what they want, Swap something out, see what works. But having that cookbook mentality is the mindset I think we should all strive for. I have nothing to really offer you at the moment. You think I would be like, all right, here's this thing. Why don't I offer you something? But I don't know. I don't have anything to share that I haven't already shared. Figured I'd at least share this sentiment. That's something. But you know what else is kind of sad? We'll end this show on a real bummer, okay? I just realized I haven't written a feature in over a year. Makes me think that if you can do, interview. See ya.